welcome once again to my RC Ramblings, and I thank you all very much for joining me. Today I thought I would talk a little bit more about some of these touring cars that I have converted into more detailed versions of realistic cars. And in specific, I thought I would mention a bit more about this Porsche 911 RSR. The actual car is based off this chassis. And the chassis itself is a relatively old touring car chassis, probably about 5-6 years old at least, if not more. It is a chassis from a company called Awesomatix, and it is the model designation A700. It's a very, very good chassis, and in fact, by today's standards, I dare say that the chassis is still as good as anything on offer. And from a technological standpoint, I'd even say it is probably better than most chassis that are out there. It was years ahead of itself in terms of design, and to me, to this day, it's still an amazing design. Car itself runs on a drive shaft rather than belt-driven chassis, which many of the newer touring cars nowadays run on. And this means that there is a huge amount of efficiency when it comes to transference of power from a more stock or a lower powered motor. And that's perfect for something such as this older 911 design that I'm creating, because I've decided I wanted to run a 21.5 turn motor down here, and this motor is definitely on the slower side. It's something which is more scale. It's also something which inhibits the overall performance of the car, which is important given that these tires are definitely not the grippiest tires available. The chassis itself is very, very low CG. You can see here that in fact the chassis is designed with everything very low. Shock absorbers are an amazing design as well. They are these little cylindrical bits that you can see here, and these provide for, again, very low CG, as well as providing for an amazing ability to adjust both damping rate as well as spring rate without changing the springs or the dampers. This was well ahead of its time, and to this day still remains so. Also very interesting about this chassis is the fact that in order to eliminate torque steer when a motor is a bit too strong on it, is the fact that this whole front transmission, you can see it move a bit there. That whole front transmission is in fact a floating transmission, meaning that as the torque from the motor comes to the front, it transmits the torque into the transmission, but it does not transmit it into the chassis in any way, as this front transmission is floating on this shaft here. So it's a really, really complete package. It's incredibly well designed. You don't even need to change blocks when you're deciding to alter the toe in of the rear, the toe out of the rear, the toe in and toe out of the front, as well as obviously done by the links here, but camber, etc. as well, all controlled by adjustments to these links at the top of the arms. Again, the car is done in such a way that it is a very clean design. You can see that underneath the chassis, it's almost as if it's an aerodynamic design here. Very little protruding underneath the chassis. It's a wide chassis, provides for full coverage of all the electronics as well. And again, it's supposed to help with the aerodynamics. You can see the shock absorbers here as well underneath, sitting very low as compared with most traditional cars. So this chassis itself, a lot of the suspension, etc. still runs, and it's still very much a current design on the suspension. The key changes to this car in recent times has been the fact that with the arrival of the A800, they removed the drive belt, or they removed rather the drive shaft from the center, and they replaced it with a belt. And that's why I decided to keep these A700 chassis, because I love the shaft-driven transmission. It was ahead of its time. To me, it still is ahead of its time, and it is an amazing design. It's very efficient. It provides immediate torque. It provides immediate power. And that's why this chassis has become a basis for a lot of my future builds. You can see that the key change that's been made in order to adapt this specific chassis to the classic 911 has been the use of different tires and wheels, where these wheels and tires are used for spec VTA racing in the US, and they do provide some pretty good grip. Again, not as good handling as the all-out touring car wheels and tires. I've also altered the body posts here so that they mount magnets. Again, key thing is for me keeping this as scale as possible, and that can only occur if I don't have these body posts sticking out through the body shell. I've got another video covering how I use these magnets. You can see here, these are the Tamiya cockpits that I have used. This one is the touring car cockpit, which only has one driver. They're getting harder and harder to come by, and as a result of that, I've recently just gone on a shopping spree just to try and hunt down all the remaining internal cockpits of Tamiya that are available. I've managed to secure 8 or 9 of them for the rally cars. I've also got about 5 of these left for touring cars. You can see that the roll cage is a separate roll cage that I have made out of just some spare old roll cages there for all these joint marks. I could have just run styrene rods and bent them, but unfortunately, because I didn't have access to the arts and crafts store and the hobby stores due to the lockdown, I decided to just make do with cutting up one of my old crawler roll cages. Driver's been detailed as well here. You can see that I've also added a sun visor to the driver, and that is to just add a certain degree of realism again. Very clearly, this is not a 911 interior, but I've decided it doesn't really matter. As long as there's a rough interior internal to this body shell, it adds enough realism for me. Created a bit of additional detail in terms of wiring systems, etc. And these all are essentially just solder that has been used and placed around the cabin to create some additional depth and detail. The body shell itself uses magnets, as you can see under here. I've also got buckets. These light buckets actually came off a Porsche 993 drift shell, and I've added these into here so that I can create clear lights out the front and the rear. They don't fit perfectly, but they're close enough. The front rally lights as well, I've decided to add these in. I have not put any lighting into this shell. Whether I will or not, I have not yet decided. We've got kill switches here as well. We've also got separate door handles that I've purchased and glued on. And in the rear, we've got an exhaust on either side as well. And the exhaust with the titanium tips, I felt were more aggressive in that it made it look like this was a real hot rod 911. Overall color scheme of this car, I decided to go with this classic blue-gray color. And rather than following with a Gulf livery, I've decided to go with a red bumper and a red front, as well as a yellow strip. So there you have the overall details of this 911 touring car. I do hope that you got something out of it, and if you have any queries or any questions, please feel free to contact me and I will do my best to answer them for you. In the meantime, please do take care. Thank you.